Hi, my name is Bonnie Steinroeder, and I'm the pastor.
And my name is John Moore, and I'm the policeman.
We want to welcome you tonight to our very first episode of The Pastor and the Policeman. Before we get started, I just want to mention that if you're watching this on Facebook, I hope you'll take the time to type in a question or any comments that you have. Really, the purpose of the show is for us to begin a community-wide conversation, so we really want you to be a part of that. Just wanted to give you a tiny background on how the show came to be and what we're hoping to be about over the next time that next series of shows that we do. John and I were both guests on a panel about the Second Amendment, about gun rights that Mary Greendale had on her Just Thinking show. And we got to talking and we realized afterward that both of us have a similar interest in the Constitution. Not so much just to learn it for its own sake, like when I was in school we had to do a lot of memorization, but what we're really both interested in is what relevance does it have for us today. We both come from the perspective that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. It was written a long time ago, and as we'll talk about tonight with the Fourth Amendment, when the framers wrote the Constitution, they could never even imagine what our world would be like today. So really the point of our show is to talk a little bit about it. We'll give you a little bit of background, and then we really want to talk about the meaning that it has for our lives.
So when Bonnie and I, like she had said, discovered that we had a mutual interest in the Constitution, we talked about doing a show on it. And we said to ourselves, what would be the vehicle to propel this? We can't just come on and talk about each amendment individually. So we found a series of books called the Inalienable Rights series, published by Oxford University Press. These books have come out over, say, the last 10 or 11 years. There are 17 volumes so far. It's a growing set. And each book seems to point to an individual right, privilege, or duty contained within the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. So because it's the forefront of our thoughts today, we decided to do a book on the Fourth Amendment, and the title is The Future of Foreign Intelligence, Privacy and Surveillance in the Digital Age. And it is written by Laura Donahue. She is a law professor at Georgetown University Law School. She is definitely a scholar, maybe one of the leading scholars in the country on the Fourth Amendment and on digital surveillance. So it's a great book to start with, and we're going to go through bits and pieces of it. We're going to discuss our opinions as to what she had written about. She writes in a very impartial manner, a very informative manner. She starts with the history of what she's talking about in this book, and that all comes back to the Fourth Amendment. Now, without going through the Fourth Amendment word for word, the Fourth Amendment protects our rights as citizens from unreasonable search and seizure. Now, seizure is, or the best example I can give of seizure is you detain somebody. Someone from the government detains you. Usually it's someone from law enforcement. And a search is when someone goes through either your house, your car, your briefcase, or in certain instances, especially lately, through your cell phone, maybe through your iPad. So this amendment is extremely important to our civil liberties. You're hearing that from a retired police officer, but I take this amendment, as I take all amendments, very seriously, and I think all citizens should know about it. And know that they can be secure in their house, their car, their cell phone, or whatnot. Now, in terms of history of the Fourth Amendment, and we could do a whole show on that, we're not going to go that route, but the Fourth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution actually was drawn from, and this is a point of pride for people from Massachusetts, from the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, which was written 11 years before our own Bill of Rights was written. Article 14 within our Declaration of Rights has essentially the same language as the Fourth Amendment. So they took it from us. Why did we need a Fourth Amendment? In colonial times, the British government would exercise their rights at the time to what was called writs of assistance. And that would mean that they could seize American citizens. They could search them without really any probable cause. And probable cause is another term that we'll talk about later on in the show. So because of writs of assistance, our founders decided to write the Fourth Amendment to try to prevent those from happening again. Now, fast forward to closer in time, we had talked about search and seizure, and it usually involved a physical intrusion, okay, into someone's home, someone's pockets, someone's effects. There was a case decided in 1967, and without going into the facts, in terms of the time that we have tonight, there was a case called Katz versus United States. And in that case, a man by the name of Charles Katz was involved in illegal gambling. And the FBI had him under surveillance. And at some point in time, he went to a public telephone booth, of which the FBI had attached an eavesdropping device on. And they were able to listen to his conversations and eventually able to arrest him and prosecute him. However, the issue came up whether or not this was a search and seizure, especially since he's in a public place, and it wasn't a physical intrusion into either something he owned or something he had control of. In that case, they said that this was a physical intrusion, that Mr. Katz had a right of privacy to his conversation within a public telephone booth.
And I would say, like, at least for me, I never thought about this amendment very much until the whole Patriot Act, until 9/11. And I feel like that's when things took a real turn, and I began to think about this in a different way. And I remember so when the Patriot Act, was up and it got voted in and it went through, I didn't really understand at first why it was so controversial, because it felt like, okay, here we'd been attacked, we have to respond in some way. And until I really thought about it and read more about it in the book, I didn't realize it was a real tipping point in terms of how our surveillance is now been moved, because people don't, well, I guess if you're Michael Cohen, maybe they burst into your house and seize all of your things, but generally speaking, when I think about the surveillance now, it's done electronically, and that's something that our framers could never have imagined.
No.
Right, with the cell phone and the computer. So John, this is what I really feel about it, and I'd love to hear what you think about this. So I'm extremely conflicted about the surveillance. There's one part of me that feels like, fine, take my phone, take my computer. My life is extremely boring. You won't find anything on there. I don't think that would, have to put that caveat. I don't think that would incriminate me in any way. So I feel like if you're innocent, why would you care? But then the other side of that is, how much privacy do we really want to give up? Right. I don't know. What do you think?
You make a great point, and I'd, bring us back to one of your opening comments about the Constitution being a living document. And obviously, they had no idea how far technology would reach. We today don't know how far it's going to reach in, say, 3-5 years from now. So with that in mind, and I agree with you, the tipping point was 9/11. And the Patriot Act. And what happened was, right after 9/11, the whole country was behind the government in terms of protecting us from another terrorist act. And that led to the Patriot Act being passed. And the use of surveillance was primarily, and it still is to this day, to gather intelligence from foreign agents or foreign countries that might do us harm. And it was set up in such a way that even before 9/11, we had what was called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the courts that went along with it. And if you were, part of the CIA or the FBI, you could go to what was called the FISA court, seek a warrant to do surveillance on someone from a foreign country or someone that's a foreign agent. The issue then became, and like I said and you said, after 9/11, we were able to, or we were willing to give up certain rights of privacy and civil liberties for
Right,
our
even
own
at the
protection.
airport, right? Even at the
Right,
airport, right?
right.
Taking, I mean, practically stripping an airport, right,
Yep.
to get through the thing now. And I don't mind doing that
Right.
if it's going to keep me safe.
Right. Yep.
But do you feel like the Patriot Act kept us safer, or has kept us safer?
You know, it's tough to tell. I think it has, but I can't point to any specific instances. I think a lot of that is kept secret for our own good.
Right.
However, the problem becomes that if the government is trying to gather foreign surveillance, and in fact they intrude on our civil liberties or our privacy,
Right.
and say they gather information of a criminal enterprise,
Right.
then really there should have been a higher burden imposed. See, what they do is they set up what's called the FISA wall.
Right.
On the one side is gathering of foreign intelligence. On the other side is criminal prosecutions, investigations. On this side, on the criminal prosecutions, it's run by the Fourth Amendment, probable cause. On the foreign intelligence side, it's a lower burden.
Right. Right.
And this gives people heartburn, for lack of a better term, that maybe they'll get caught up in some foreign surveillance and be charged criminally.
Well, and we have that whole thing now. I don't think we talked about this before, but when you're talking, what it reminds me of is FISA used to be very secret, and now with the current administration, it's become a lot more public because there was a whole thing about Carter Page.
Right.
And the government felt that he was a foreign agent, or perhaps could be, or doing criminal acts. So they went to the judge, they had permission, and now for political reasons on either side, people are either saying, well, you can't do that, that's not right, and other people are saying we have to do that. And I think for me, one of the things I don't like, or that I worry about, is that it's being brought more into the public how FISA operates, which I would think intelligence is less effective if your enemy knows you have it.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so I think the whole FISA issue has become really front and center right now.
It has, and its original intent was for it to be a secret operation,
Right.
a secret court to protect us, that we would have faith in our government, we would trust them to do the right thing. However, we didn't want our own people to get caught up in it.
Right.
And that if it led them to criminal information, is that now being shared with law enforcement? And that's an issue.
Right, and it is an issue. And I think the author of this book comes down, I think she's pretty balanced, but I think she definitely comes down on the side of arguing for erring toward giving us more privacy.
Yes.
And I think I agree with that, but I know one of the cases that I've mentioned to you before that really has me thinking about it was a terrorist attack in San Bernardino,
Right.
where people were murdered. The terrorists, they left their cell phones in the car.
Right.
Police found that it was encrypted.
Right.
They were not able to read it, and then there was a big law case about whether Apple they refused to break the code. I think eventually they paid some guy like $50 to break the code.
They did.
So
They
that's
did.
it. But, I don't know so in that case, so you're in law enforcement, so maybe you feel differently, but for me, it was really clear to me that these people had committed a horrible act, and it was fine to find out what was on their phone because I wanted to know, was anybody else involved? So what's the argument for not doing that in a case like that?
I get that, and the context that you're using is a mass shooting,
Right.
where a lot of innocent people
Right.
died, and everybody wants law enforcement to
Right.
have all the rights that they can. However, and this might sound contrary to where I come from, but if you do it in that case, do you now allow it in a smaller case where, say,
Right.
no one got hurt,
Right.
and maybe somebody's ID was taken?
Right.
Do you allow the police to go into a cell phone? I mean, cell phones are quite the issue now with law enforcement, and there has been a number of cases that have come down. No need to go into the details, but originally the police thought that they could go into the content of a cell phone, or use a cell phone to determine the location of the user. In the last 3 years, there's been a number of cases that have come, 2 cases in particular that have come down that have said that the police now need a warrant.
Right.
They need to come forward with probable cause, convince a third party, being a judge, that they have a right to go into this phone. And at times, they're not going to be granted a warrant. The other issue with the phone in terms of the encryption, I can see it from the viewpoint of the manufacturer of the phone. Do they really want to sell a phone that people can't keep information private?
But why do you need your conversation encrypted if you're not doing anything wrong?
Well, that's true.
That's
true,
what I wonder. Like, I can't think of any conversation I have that needs to be encrypted.
I know, but I use this as an example in a criminal justice class that I taught, and I think it's a good example. And I heard that same thing from a student.
Right.
And I said, let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that in this classroom, and I think I had 42 students in the classroom, that the state police came and knocked on the door and said, Mr. Moore, someone within your class just texted a terrorist threat, and I want all the cell phones. One student in particular said the same exact thing you did, which was, I don't have anything to be ashamed of. I didn't do anything wrong that's on my phone. I'll give up my phone. And I said, all right, let's take it a step further. They keep your phone for 30 days, for 60 days, for 6 months.
Okay.
And they're going through it and going through it. And maybe you forgot that someone texted a joke to you at some point, and you get caught up in something. And the students started to see the other side.
Right, so or maybe I'm talking about how I'm avoiding all my parking speeding tickets.
Yeah.
But there could be something on there that might not be illegal, but that it goes back to the whole cats thing, right? Which was that the reason that they decided that it was not okay to tap that phone booth is because he had an expectation, a reasonable expectation of privacy. Yes. And it's the same thing, right? If we're talking on our cell phones, or I'm texting my friend or my children or my husband, I expect that's going to be kept private.
Right.
But what do people use encryption for if it's not like...
Well, I mean the other reason that they might encrypt their phones is if they lose it and someone else gets into it.
So they don't get all their private, like their banking data and all of that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, it might be something totally innocent, but it might harm you at some point. Now, you had brought up a good point earlier about the airport.
Right.
After 9/11, TSA came into being.
Right.
And the scrutiny at airports has gone through the roof. People do complain about it due to the delay, but I think they see the purpose behind it. Which is to make sure that we don't have another terrorist plot similar to 9/11. The same thing goes for courthouses. When you go into a courthouse, you go through a metal detector. If it goes off, someone searches you. They go through your briefcase.
I went to see Hamilton the other night and had to go through metal detectors. And they searched my purse. And at first I thought, okay, this is a little weird. And then I thought, oh, this is great. I mean, I did. I thought this is great because now I know that...
Well, you're one of the minority then.
I am? Really?
I think a lot of people have a problem with it, but it's there to protect us, whether it be Fenway Park, a play, a courthouse, a school, the airport. Under the purpose of trying to protect us all, sometimes they have to take away some of our liberties. And I mean the government, whether it be the federal government, the state government, or local government.
You think that bothers most people?
I think that they will lodge a complaint about it. I think eventually they come around and say this is a fact of life right now. And I come back to the cell phones again, which is a huge issue. Most people, and in the case law that I've read, most people have within their phone more information than they would within their whole house in terms of their paperwork or records.
Right. Calendar, all my contact, everything, my banking, everything is on there.
And as we're talking about cell phones, and we're kind of jumping all over the place, but it's an interesting subject. Our phones, most of our phones carry some form of GPS within them. I know when, I'm a creature of habit, so I do certain things during the week. And if I get into my car with my phone on, it'll tell me how long it's going to take to get to wherever I was last week at that time. That data is in there also. I mean, you know, do you possibly want someone scrutinizing where you were last week?
So when you put it like that, I can see that, right?
Yeah.
Because you might, I might not want, you know, these Big Brother or whatever, I might not want someone to know that I had lunch with so-and-so, not because I did anything wrong, but there I feel like the privacy. Like, again, I don't care about the theater or the airport. I want to be safe. But if it's not a safety issue, then I do care. If they're tracking my every move and who I'm meeting with and, you know, what books I'm taking out of the library or whatever, you know.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's part of the Patriot Act also. They can actually look into, you know, books that you've checked out.
They can see that we're taking out this wonderful series called Inalienable Rights, you know.
You were spot on when you said earlier that, if anything, she trends towards more privacy, that maybe our gathering of foreign intelligence has gone a little too far. And she promotes FISA reform. Which means maybe a higher standard to get a warrant to do surveillance on someone. And also she promotes that what I called earlier the FISA wall, which is if you're gathering foreign intelligence, you really shouldn't be trying to gather criminal evidence. They're two different things and they should be separate.
So one thing about the FISA wall, and maybe I don't totally understand it, but before 9/11, what I remember hearing that part of the issue was that the different like the FBI couldn't talk to the CIA, couldn't talk because there was this wall. I don't know if it's the same thing. And after that, it broke open a bit so there could be better communication. And that seems to make sense to me, though, in a way, to have all the branches of government sharing that information, because someone over here might have it at the CIA, but the FBI doesn't know that it's going on, and then you have an event that maybe could have been stopped. But now they share all that info, right?
They do share that information. I mean, what I would say is one good thing that came out of what happened after 9/11 was collaboration amongst federal, state, and local law enforcement. They do share that information. They do work together. I knew a number of FBI agents when I actually was a police officer, and a lot of them, their mission changed after 9/11. The FBI, which you would normally think is just a domestic law enforcement agency, most of their agents were dedicated then to counterterrorism and counterintelligence. And they were working closely with the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security. That's a good thing.
Yes.
Because the bottom line is they're there to protect us, whether it be, you know, some type of foreign plot to do harm to us or some type of criminal enterprise that might do something to us.
Right. And I do like what you said before, too, because I do think it is important to think about where that line is. So, again, I might not care if I have to take off my shoes or do whatever, or if they were to read certain things on my phone. But then you're right. Where is that line? For a major terrorist attack, I think we all agree. Break open that encryption. Let's see the information. But then if law enforcement becomes dependent upon using that, they could begin to use it for minor things that don't require that level of response.
I mean, if law enforcement comes into gathering information from, say, another agency, information of which they wouldn't get because they don't have probable cause. Or they didn't have a judge that issued a warrant for them.
Do you want to say more about what probable cause is?
I mean, probable cause is a burden that, in this instance, in this context, probable cause is a burden that is borne by law enforcement. And they have to prove to a neutral third party, usually a clerk magistrate or a judge, that it's more likely than not that certain evidence will be found or that a certain person committed a crime. It's a burden that is taken very seriously by both law enforcement and by the judicial branch.
Because that seems like a pretty big burden to me. Like if I'm a judge, they have to be able to demonstrate that it is more probable that Right. And I think what I've heard is that the FISA judges especially do take that most of them take that very seriously.
They do, but the burden is just a little bit lower. I mean, it's been defined in case law,
Right.
but it's kind of a nebulous subject matter. But the burden is a little bit lower in the FISA court than it would be in a criminal court. And I agree with that.
Right.
I want our agencies that deal with, foreign intelligence to get as much as they can. However, I don't want them to cross that line, that FISA wall that we keep talking about.
Right. And I think one thing you said before really stood out to me. You said, and I think it's not true anymore, you said in the past we trusted our government to do the right thing. And whether that was right or wrong, I think we did as a society. And now you can just see it in the polls. People do not trust institutions. They do not trust the government in the same way. And I think even though you shouldn't trust any agency blindly, I do think that it's a problem that trust is being eroded in that way. Because if we don't trust that they're looking out for our best interests, then I don't know what happens.
I mean, I think we're doing the right thing in terms of this show and getting people to do more reading about it, especially more discussions about it.
Yes, does anyone have any Facebook comments?
I would say this, and I still teach cops to this day, even though I'm retired from law enforcement. But I discussed this many times when I was in law enforcement, that the Bill of Rights is there for us as law enforcement officers to make sure that people are guaranteed these rights. Right. I think a lot of people think that law enforcement looks at the Bill of Rights, or specifically the Fourth Amendment, and says, how do I get around this?
Right.
What's the exception? When in fact what we should be doing is being in a protector role. These are your rights. I remember countless conversations with other police officers that I worked with where we would be dealing with the Fourth Amendment, and we wouldn't use technically the term probable cause, but we would say, do you think I have it? Do I have enough? Do I have enough to do this? And if we didn't, then we wouldn't take an action.
So let me ask you this, and we haven't talked about this before, but so when you were talking, it made me think of the stop and frisk. Is that a Fourth Amendment issue?
That is.
And so that's kind of the same thing where law enforcement is often accused of, profiling and so not thinking about, is there really probable cause? And so that feels like a really true-to-life application that the law enforcement has to be so well trained, and citizens have to know our rights.
Right.
That they, a cop cannot just come up to us for any reason and search us. Right? Is that right?
You brought up a good point, and it's a little different than, say, searching someone's house, car, briefcase, or cell phone. That's based on probable cause.
And you need a warrant for that.
Oh, yeah.
But you don't need a warrant for stop and frisk, right?
You don't. What you need is a lower burden, which is called reasonable suspicion. All right, so reasonable suspicion is, I as a law enforcement officer feel that you either just committed or you're about to commit a crime. So stop and frisk would be a limited detention of someone to talk to them. Frisk only deals with whether or not you have reason to believe that they're armed and dangerous.
Okay.
So you'd have to have some information, whether you saw it or it came to you and it was credible, that allowed you to frisk someone.
Right.
Now, even lower burden, the no burden, is you can talk to anybody who you want to.
Right, you see me on the street and...
Right. But you don't have to stay around for the conversation.
Oh, right. Okay, so that's a really good point, right? So my rights are that, I don't, unless I'm being charged with something, unless I'm under suspicion of something, I can say, I don't feel like talking to you today, John.
And it's happened to many
to you very often.
Well, you talk about the three levels, and just to summarize it, I can come up to you and I can start a conversation with you. If I don't have reasonable suspicion or probable cause, you can end it and walk away, and there's nothing I can do.
Right.
If I have reasonable suspicion that you've been involved in criminal activity, then I can start to talk to you, and if you walk away, I can say, hang on, Bonnie, there's a couple other things I want to go over with you.
Right.
If I have reasonable suspicion that you might be armed and dangerous based on what I see or what someone else told me that's credible, then I can frisk you.
Okay.
If, say, you're carrying a pocketbook all right, and I want to go through that pocketbook, I have to have probable cause. It's a higher
Okay.
level, all right? So I have to have probable cause that there is evidence in there of a crime,
Right.
all right?
And that's
a
probably the
lot.
more
That's a lot to
old-fashioned.
digest.
It is, but this is why it's so important, I think, that we're talking about this. Because, I mean, I've read the book, you've read the book,
Right.
we've had some conversations, and I still don't know where I stand on all of this. I can be persuaded either way, depending on the situation, but I feel like as a citizen, it's just really important for me to know what my rights are
Right.
and to really think about them and how important they are. And as a citizen, then let my representatives know in Congress or right, because we're doing this so people can become active participants in the process.
Yes. And you're never going to get to a point where you know it all or you don't have any questions.
I thought that's why we had you on the show.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, we'll wrap it up with this, but I'll give you a quote, and I can't tell you the exact law professor that I had, but it was first year of law school, and we would do the case method. You would read cases, and then you would get questioned in class. And one law professor said to the class, is there anyone in this class that has no questions about this case? And a few people raised their hands, myself included. And he or she said, then you didn't read it. Because if you really read it, then you'd have 10 questions.
Right.
And that's what we're doing here. So we're starting people on this conversation. We're starting with the Fourth Amendment.
And why don't we tell them what we're going to do next time?
We will. And when we're on again, whether it be in a month and a half, we're going to move on to free speech. This is the book, Why We Should Resist It, Free Speech, Not Censorship. So all about free speech next time. We'll get studying. We'll have some talking points for you, and hopefully you read this book and you move on to the next one after we talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Oh, and we have a couple comments. Oh, so Dorothy Pelosi, who I've known for about 40 years, thank you for saying great conversation. We have others. Thank you so much for your positive comments, Susan and Aaron and Kristen and Kim Young. Thank you so much. We really are so honored that you've joined us tonight, and we hope that you'll tell your friends and you'll join us next time when we talk about free speech.
Thank you.
Thank you.